Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. That's going to take us to key concept 2.5, cultural consequences of connectivity. The first thing to point out is that with all of this interconnection, thanks to the what I call the big four trade networks in Afro Eurasia, there's going to be a lot of diffusion of literary, artistic, and cultural traditions, as well as scientific and technological innovations. So, for example, Christianity is going to spread throughout, say, Northern Europe in this time. The Vikings are going to become predominantly Christian. Islam is spreading widely throughout Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia in this time period. Neo Confucian traditions are spreading, like, for instance, under the Ming Dynasty. Hinduism is spreading in South and Southeast Asia. Buddhism is spreading across many places in Southeast and East Asia. There's connectivity and trade in the Americas also. This is meant to represent the Incan religion, and this is meant to represent the Aztecs. Examples of cultural diffusions then are influence of Buddhism in East and Southeast Asia, the spread of Hinduism and Buddhism into Southeast Asia. So that's going to mean also, like, for instance, the spread of the Bhagavad Gita, one of the literary texts associated with the Hindu religion. That's also going to involve, like, for instance, the spread of the Quran and Arabic literary traditions throughout Islamic areas. Keep in mind, Christianity is not just spreading in Europe in this time period, it's also popular in Ethiopia as well as in West Africa, for instance, in the Congo. Examples of scientific or technological innovations include gunpowder, which originated in China or Korea and ended up spreading on the Silk Road, largely thanks to the Mongols, who began to use cannons by the end of their conquests and spread that technology. Paper making from China. The Chinese were the first ones to use the type of paper that you and I are more accustomed to. In the Mediterranean basin, they were used to using papyrus. But anyway, paper making techniques came from China, and they diffused through the Islamic world after the Battle of the Talas River in 751, when Chinese scholars taught Muslim people how to make paper. The technology sparked an enormous increase in education throughout the Dar al-Islam. For centuries, Muslim scholars ended up preventing this technology from spreading into Christian European areas, as one Muslim scholar said, because they didn't want the Christians to spread their lies. However, with the advent of the Crusades, papermaking techniques spread into Christian European areas, and likewise, starting in like the 13th century, there was an enormous explosion of education throughout the medieval European and then early Renaissance European world. The fate of cities varied greatly, with periods of significant decline and periods of increased urbanization, buoyed by rising productivity and expanding trade networks. This is from last year, so ignore the part about the time period being 1,000 years long. But there were a whole bunch of cities that went into significant decline in this time period as a result of invasions, disease, decline in agricultural productivity, or the Little Ice Age. Some of those cities were like Rome, Athens, Alexandria, cities that had been more important in the classical era, in China, Chang'an, in South Asia, Pataliputra. Cities, though, that became important were like Novgorod, one of the first Russian cities, Timbuktu in West Africa, Baghdad in the Middle East, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate until they were smashed by the Mongols in 1258. Hangzhou in China, Venice in the Mediterranean basin, or Calicut on the western coast of India. As exchange networks intensified, an increased number of travelers within Afro-Eurasia wrote about their travels. One of the earlier Chinese scholars who had traveled to the West was named Xuanzang, but he's before our time period in this unit. In this unit, we have like Marco Polo, who traveled from Venice throughout the Mongol world, and then Ibn Battuta, who traveled like 73,000 miles over the big four trade networks inside of his lifetime. Another example is Marjorie Kemp, Marjorie was a Christian mystic who wrote what might be the first autobiography in the English language. She traveled throughout the Mediterranean basin, visiting important Catholic religious sites, and then wrote about them afterwards. Ibn Battuta was a Moroccan scholar who came from Tangiers and traveled all throughout the big four trade networks, becoming the most widespread traveler probably until the advent of more advanced technology like steam engines and railroads and that type of thing. He wrote a book called The Relaw when he got back done with his travels, and it was put together by Rossi Dunn into a book called The Adventures of Ibn Battuta, which is a pretty spectacular book for AP World History. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Key Concept 2.5.